Not too much pressure, but the good news is the pressure's not on me because the first panel, even with great moderation, it was really about the speakers. So the pressure's on Dan. This isn't his first time. So I'm Roy Zimmerhansel. I recently set up a capital markets practice at WTS Hansuki, and quite excited about that. A big part of my background is involved with securities finance, so securities lending and repo transactions. Securities lending, for those of you who don't know it, are really the fundamental building block to what short sellers do. So we'll talk about short selling. So to me, in many ways, short sellers are the heroes of the market. The other heroes that sit alongside that are investigative journalists, because to me, those are the two entities that keep corporate entities honest. Ryan, one of the things that we'll explore today is where are the regulators, where are the auditors, why aren't they sort of stepping in and doing the role that seems to fall to these other entities? So we'll explore that. So I'm going to let Dan introduce himself, and then I will maybe add something to that. So go ahead, Dan.
Oh, well, thank you, Roy, and thank you, everyone, today. Yeah, my name's Dan McCrum, and I'm a journalist at the Financial Times. I've been there for about 18 years now. A very long time ago, I worked for a bank and quickly realized I wasn't cut out to be a banker. And I'm in the business of finding interesting stories. And the ones that I find most fun tend to be problematic companies, ones which are, without casting any aspersions over things I've happened to write about, companies that are a little bit fraudy.
Very nice. Thanks, Dan. So what Dan hasn't said is that while he's possibly best known for Wirecard story, we were sharing anecdotes about other companies that he's also covered and exposed. And he's won multiple accolades, including the Orwell Prize for Journalism and a British Journalism Award. So while we're going to expose more on the Wirecard story, the one great thing about my job is I've managed over the years to accumulate a series of books. So a few years ago, those of you that are regular FSTC attendees, you would have seen me talking to Richard Collier, interviewing him, talking about tax fraud through dividends and cum-ex and cum trading a few years ago. So I got Richard's book, got him to sign it. A few months ago, I was speaking at a conference in Macau, and I met Nick Leeson and got his book and got him to sign it. And today, this book, Dan's book, Money Men, he's kindly signed that for me. So I really encourage you to do that. And based on the book, there's also a Netflix show called Scandal. So this is my TV talk show element of it, where I'm holding it up for him and welcoming the guest. So let's get started, Dan. I guess really what a useful starting point would be, what's really the essence of the story? What do you think the one theme is? Is it greed? Is it conspiracy? Is it just bad people? What do you think?
I mean, it's hard to boil it down because, you get told as a journalist, you shouldn't become the story. And this one left me no choice. It basically turned my life upside down. And, it started out with just looking at, hey, here's a funny little company. And the more I dug, the weirder it got. Private detectives start following people around. Spies start trying to break into our email, trying to hack people. And then the regulators get involved, they leap to the defense of the company, and it becomes this huge battle. On the one hand, you have a company which says, we're not fraudsters. And on the other, you have what we thought was quite a well-recognized global newspaper. And I think the theme that you can draw out from all of that, I mean, one of it is, how hard criminals will fight when you're trying to expose them. But the big question is, why is it so hard to change people's mind when money is at stake? Because sort of the recurring thing that kept happening throughout this is we would go, hey, look at what we found. We found these incredible things about this business which just don't make sense. We went to visit their customers, and there wasn't anything there. There was just a confused family of fishermen. And people would take that and go, there's probably a decent explanation. And so I think through all of it, through the reaction of everybody, it's that, when you have a financial reason not to face the truth, it's very easy to take it.
Great, and I think we'll come back to exactly that sort of psychology point in a few minutes. But let's go back to the start. What initially triggered you to look at Wirecard?
I mean, I can vividly remember the conversation. I used to chat to, well, I still do, I chat to short sellers because I find them fascinating and also quite journalistically useful. And I was talking to this Australian, John Hempton, and he just says to me, "Hey, Dan, would you be interested in some German gangsters?" Now, the main guys did turn out to be Austrian, I should clarify that. But I was kind of like, yeah, this sounds fascinating. And it turned out he was talking about this funny little German company called Wirecard.
Right, and so where did it go from there? Like, what made you, what were the next steps? How did you get to really be looking at it?
Well, it turned out there were these two theories about the company. One was it was involved in money laundering. It was involved in electronic payments, called itself the European PayPal, and it had a certain reputation in the market. If you had some unsavory business to transact, Wirecard was your guy. But then it also seemed a little bit too good to be true. And one of the things the short sellers focused on was, maybe they're just making it up. And so I wrote a whole bunch of stories going, this company is a bit of a puzzle. But the problem is you can't use the F word in print. Fraud, obviously. And so it attracted a little bit of attention. But every time people sort of read the stories, accounting nerds liked it, short sellers liked it. But, most people would just sort of turn to the company, these respectable people in suits and ties, and they would go, oh, it's very complicated.
Right, and so how did you kind of, I guess, a little bit became synonymous with the short sellers, right? And it kind of converged in terms of what you were doing in terms of writing these articles and what was happening with some short sellers and sort of public stories. How did that sort of tie in, and were there conflicts there?
Well, so short sellers are terrific sources. And as a financial journalist, you get used to the idea that every single person you talk to, be it, executives, lawyers, advisors, they all have a stake in what you're going to write. They're all trying to make money out of it, ultimately. And most people want to see company share prices go up. And so short sellers come across to a lot of people as a bit weird and a bit off, like they're trying to spoil the party. And I understand that, and we're used to dealing with those incentives. But what Wirecard did very effectively was sort of conflate anybody who was trying to criticize the company or raise questions about it with, market manipulation. Now, they were helped in the fact that they were attacked by short sellers, and there was quite a dramatic report. It was called the Zatara report, came out at one point. And that threw an enormous amount of mud, created a big splash, sort of 2016, and the German government investigated the authors of that for sort of possible market manipulation.
Right, so that's the interesting part to me. So the regulators who were responsible for the activity of companies, rather than investigate those allegations or the questions, I guess, that you and others had raised, they instead focused on the people raising the issues, including yourself. What did that mean for you?
I mean, when it first happened, I kind of thought the world had turned upside down. So I looked into Wirecard for about 6 years in total, and I finally get this big break. This whistleblower gets in touch, gives us a huge stack of documents, and finally we can use that F word in print. We can show that there is fraud going on, just in a little part of their business, but it raises really serious questions, Why are guys running around inside their finance team forging documents? And we published the story, sort of January 2019. And it goes out, and within a very short space of time, about 8 billion euros is knocked off the value of the company. And, we're watching that, and I'm going, I really hope this is right. But what was really weird was the reaction. So Wirecard denies that any of this is true. But they also accuse us of market manipulation. They say there's been suspicious trading around the publication of our article. And what happens is the German government buys this line. They announce an investigation into me and my colleague Stefania Palmer, who helped write the articles. And then they ban short selling in Wirecard stock to protect the German economy. You know, the only time they'd done that before was the financial crisis. And so at that point, you do feel like, I felt like I was going a little bit mad. You know, what on earth is going on with this company? Is it protected? Have we missed something? And you know, there's lots of reasons behind that. But I think what Wirecard did very effectively was give everybody an enemy. You know, they demonized us. It was a lot easier for, you know, everybody involved in this, what was now one of Germany's largest listed companies, to go, you know, maybe there's a corrupt journalist over there in another country. You know, in London, everything's a bit seedy in London finance, right? Rather than having to ask themselves, hang on a second, is there a problem here in this company we're rather fond of?
Yeah, I think it's probably worth for those people that aren't familiar with Wirecard to kind of maybe just very, very quickly chart its journey from just a company to being a real tech darling and actually, you know, becoming a national champion.
Yeah, so Wirecard's background was in, you know, processing credit card payments. Lots of companies do it. And they were sort of behind the scenes. You know, they would work with, you know, the merchants. So when you use your credit card in a shop or in a business online, they made it all work and move the money around. And lots of people do it, but Wirecard was sort of growing faster than everybody else. We're a little bit more profitable. And they just had this really compelling pitch. You know, this is a very complicated business, but all you really need to know is that the cashless economy is coming. It's going to be huge, and we're going to be a big part of that. And that really worked because Europe doesn't have a lot of tech companies. You know, particularly in Germany, you know, loads of great manufacturers and basically one big software company, SAP, which works with big manufacturers. So Wirecard was kind of cool, like it had an English name, Wirecard, you know, not German. It sounds stupid, but it was all the, you know, it operated in English. It was global. And so it just sort of, you know, really presented as the next big thing. You know, the chief executive would walk around in a black turtleneck, like he was, you know, a cousin of Steve Jobs. You know, if you weren't really paying that much attention, it looked and felt like a great tech company.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that you mentioned earlier that I want to go back to, because there's all of a sudden you have this kind of national champion. People want to get behind it. That includes investors, you know, and shockingly, it included employees at the regulator, which for those of you that have worked at banks, I don't know, I mean, I've spent most of my career working at banks. It's really difficult to buy stocks and trade stocks if you actually are a bank employee for compliance. And particularly if it's a company that has any kind of involvement with your firm, that's just banned. I was absolutely stunned that employees at BaFin were allowed to own any shares, let alone shares of a company that had been called into question for fraud.
Yeah, I think they might have changed the rules now, but yeah, the regulator, everybody there could just trade stocks. And they actually had to investigate themselves because sort of there came this big moment where, you know, the truth finally came out. And the regulator knew about a day or two beforehand that it was all going badly. And at least one of the BaFin employees used that to inside information to trade and sell their stock ahead of time. And so, yes, I mean, there's a lot of questions about the regulator, but I think that gets to, you know, the culture of an institution.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. And it's interesting about regulators and short sellers, and maybe this is the last comment. One of the phrases that I think is really appropriate here is too local to fail, where there's a tie-in between sort of national champions, the regulators that allegedly oversee them, and the importance that they have psychologically for the country. And we talked about other examples, and I can reel off many examples, but there's examples in France, in the UK, in Italy, in Spain, where these companies just get ignored by the regulator despite noise, whether that's investigative journalists, short sellers, or whatever, and just completely avoid it.
I think, yeah, you see it a lot, isn't it? It's human nature. You play to people's, greed, but also pride. And what frauds like this take advantage of is that sort of general level of trust in society. Nobody checks anything because you'd waste enormous amounts of time if you checked every single bit of business that you were doing. Every time you signed a contract, if you were like, oh, well, I better investigate if this company is real. Are there offices there? You would waste so much time because almost always they are. And I think also, if you're seen to be, part of some glorious future, then you kind of get a pass for a lot of things. And, there's quite a large car company which is responsible for, the electric car transition, which is somewhat controversial, but its leader also has been the subject of multiple regulatory investigations, which haven't really amounted to very much.
Yeah, we could do a whole session.
Yeah, we could talk a very long time on that,
which I'd love to do. But look, if only there were, you were talking about not being able to check other people, right? When you sign up a contract, if only there were a type of organization that looked at the activities of a company and their financial accounting and audited them. If only there was someone that audited them that could be trusted. Oh wait, there's their auditors. So maybe let's talk about the two entities that the public trusts to validate what companies are doing. One being the regulators, are they complying with regulations? The other being the auditors, are they following the rules for accounting? Is this company a legitimate company? I think this is a spectacular fail on the part of EY here. So where did that come into your investigations, and what did you uncover?
I'm going to agree with you. Sort of EY is properly negligent. So Ernst & Young audited Wirecard for a decade. And there's this key moment that happens in 2016. Because if you're committing a large-scale accounting fraud, the problem that you always have to solve is you're supposedly very profitable, so you should have a lot of cash. So where is it? And most of the things that you look for when you're trying to solve or prove that something is a fraud are the tells that are left behind as you try and solve that problem. And in 2016, Wirecard came up with this new wheeze. You know what? We've got these special bank accounts. And they're not in our name, they're looked after by a trustee. So go talk to the trustee. And at the time, the guy was in Singapore, this little service provider. And so Ernst & Young go and get in touch with the trustee and say, yes, can we talk to you about these bank accounts? And he's like, what are you talking about? I don't do any of that. Sorry. And so Ernst & Young go back to Wirecard and like, yeah, this guy says he doesn't know anything about it. And like, oh, right. There must have been a mistake. Go talk to him again. And so they go talk to him again. He's like, oh, yeah, no, sorry, completely forgot. Yeah, here are some copies of the bank statements. Everything's fine. And they didn't go and check with the underlying banks. They just took his word for it. And at that point, once you can just make up cash, then each year all you have to do is add another zero. And that's what it turned out to be. Ultimately, Wirecard, at the time when it collapsed, had $1.9 billion sitting in these sort of special bank accounts. And it's quite hard to explain how you get it that wrong as an auditor. And all of the audit firms have their own examples where they've been caught out by fraud. It is kind of the nature of the beast. But, checking the bank accounts is sort of supposed to be a day one thing of the audit. But, I think it is also worth mentioning one of the things that Wirecard did very well was use professional consultancies and their reputation. And I don't know whether anyone here has had an experience of this, but there are a couple of subtle ways which a company like Wirecard can use a professional services firm to get away with stuff. Because you use the way in which these firms work. So there comes this moment in 2019 where we've written about the fraud. EY is under an enormous amount of pressure, and there's a lot of attention being placed on the audit. So how do they get past it? Well, what Wirecard does is they hire a law firm. And that law firm then hires a consulting firm, FTI Consulting. And what they do is they go, all these questions have been raised by the FT. We would like you to look into it. And they hand them a bunch of documents. And this consulting firm goes away, produces a report, and they hand that report to a law firm, which has looked into some other aspects of it. And then the law firm hands a report to Ernst & Young. Now, if you look at the details of each report, it says, this is based on the information provided to us. So at each stage of the process, this is really just Wirecard manipulating events. It is controlling the flow of information. But at each stage, it's just adding that very respectable brand name to it. And so EY is presented with, this series of information that has gone through these very respectable firms, and it ticks a whole load of boxes, and it signs off on the audit. And I think it's one of those things which, as a journalist, okay, this is how these firms operate. And I think it's an interesting question of what do you do as a professional advisor? And I don't really know, I've never been in that situation, but if you're earning a lot of money from sort of selling your reputation like that, what should you do?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. I've actually personally had to deal with this, right? So although I've done whatever it is, 11 years of consulting, I've never done it within a regulated firm, which of course I am doing now. And so, frankly, it's been interesting for me dealing with exactly those issues under the guidance of Ali and the team. So it is something that deserves to be and must be protected, and that changes your approach, and it rightly should. But it is kind of a different approach, because I think that professional services firm that said, yeah, we've done the best with the information that we've been provided, and so we're okay. They probably feel, well, we're okay, because if you're going to lie to us and we say, well, the information we were told, we didn't know it was a lie, we're okay. And that's really the challenge, right? And I think that's why you'll always need investigative journalists. That's why regulators can't find it, because they look at the filings they're given. A regulator looking at a filing. We talked about this last night over dinner on tax filing. As you get more, one of the things I wonder about is as you get more data being provided and much more of the reporting being standardized data, what that says to a potential fraudster says, I know what the output's going to be. If the tax authorities are going to be relying on the output, well, I just have to make certain that whatever transaction I do looks okay from that output, and less on the qualitative analysis of what I'm doing and how I arrived at that. So that's an interesting thing. And do you come across this across other companies? You've talked about Foley. You and I have talked about that, but you regularly put out stories just highlighting potential glitches or questions in other companies. How does this all tie together?
Well, so I think one of the key things that I would take away from all of this is to understand what we are trying to do as journalists. And basically, I am looking for cockroaches. A cockroach is a lie. And there's this great phrase which this short seller, Mark Cahodes, in the States use. He says, there's never just one cockroach. You spot a cockroach in your kitchen, there's going to be an awful lot more of them hiding underneath the fridge. And that's what you have if you find a company lying about something. Anything. This is why we have sort of integrity rules as, if you're involved in any sort of financial services, because it's kind of like, well, if we catch you cheating in any aspect of your life, that kind of tells us about your character. And so what you're doing as a journalist is to prove an entire fraud, like to go, this entire company is corrupt, is very rare, quite challenging, as the Wirecard thing turns out, and something you're never going to do with just one story. But so what you're trying to do is go, hey, look everyone, we found this one bit which raises some very serious questions about the ethics of this company or the practices, and you now kind of have to fill in the pieces. Regulators, investors, would you kind of maybe pay a bit more attention to it? And sometimes that's very difficult. I mean, and not every company is necessarily a fraud, but so we've written about some of the things I've written about recently. So there's a big company called Adani, which was attacked by Hindenburg Research, the US short seller outfit. And it basically said the entire thing is a fraud. Complicated sort of stock market fraud, underlying frauds. And we looked into some part of it, and it's very clear that Adani is buying coal in places like Indonesia. And by the time it gets to India, where it's then sold to like government-owned power stations, the price seems to have gone up rather suspiciously. And it looks like a fairly straightforward, price inflation fraud. But when you're also friends with the Prime Minister, these kind of things tend not to matter. But I think it tells you something about the kind of people and the kind of company that you're dealing with.
And I think that goes back to an extent to the sort of the too local to fail kind of thing. Merkel was tied up with trying to introduce Wirecard through political connections and promote it as a national champion. So I think that's normal. We've got a few minutes left. I just want to, let's quickly talk about how it ended, and then I want to move on to the personal impact on you, if you don't mind. But how did the whole thing finish? Well, it hasn't finished, sorry. How did the fraud get accepted and identified, and the whole thing collapse? So
October 2019, we write a story which says, this is how they're committing the fraud. These are the fake customers. This is how it's all structured. And if you don't believe us, here are the underlying documents. And I thought that was fairly conclusive. But what happens is the company says, okay, nobody trusts our auditors anymore. To clear all of this up, we're going to bring in a new set, KPMG, and they're going to do a special audit to prove that we're not crooks. Oh, by the way, it's going to take 6 months. And at that moment, I thought they might get away with it. 6 months to make up some new story. But then KPMG came in, and because they had none of the baggage of EY attached to them, and they were coming into this very controversial situation, they had a big incentive to be sticklers for details. And they asked, where's all your money? And Wirecard took a long time to answer this question. Then they went, oh, yes, we completely forgot to mention. Yeah, the guy who looks after it's changed. It's now a lawyer in the Philippines. So they all went to the Philippines to meet him. And so you have this troupe of German lawyers and accountants who go to Manila, go to his penthouse office. And when they walk in, the first thing they see is his YouTube studio. He has a little plaque which says he has 100,000 subscribers to his YouTube channel. And when you go to it, it turns out that this lawyer mainly gives advice on family law, divorce, what to do in cases of adultery, things like that. But he's great friends with the president, went to the same fraternity. So, tick in the box, I guess. And so then they go, well, we should probably go to the banks. So they go downstairs, and he's got police motorcycle outriders with them to help them get through the traffic. But instead of going to the main financial center, they drive for 40 minutes and come to quite a low-rent street. And they all crowd into this tiny bank branch. No customers, just a guy behind the counter who sort of pops up, "Yeah, can I help?" He's like, "Yeah, we'd like to talk about Wirecard, please." And he's like, "Wirecard?" Then the lawyer hisses at him, "Wirecard!" He's like, "Ah, yes!" And he produces a letter, hands it to the lawyer hands it to the accountants, and it's a bank statement. It says Wirecard has almost €1 billion in this account, with this bank. They go and do the same process at another bank. And so EY fly home, and they've got proof, right? But they do start to get a little bit nervous. So they try and get in touch with the banks themselves, and nothing happens. So eventually someone very senior at EY in Germany calls up the head of each bank and says, can you look into it, please? And 2 letters arrive back in Germany, and they say, these bank accounts are spurious. At which point 2 things happen. The first is that everybody in Germany has to Google the slightly obscure English word, spurious. And then when they discover that this means the bank accounts don't exist, well, all hell breaks loose. And quite soon after, Wirecard announces that 1.9 billion euros is missing. The share price collapses. And I mean, this is during COVID, so I'm kind of sitting at home in our house, like waiting for the announcement. Are they going to release the accounts? And this message comes across the screen, you know, no audit, 1.9 billion euros missing. And kind of at that moment, I knew it was all over, that we'd won. And it was it was only then that I realized all the pressure, like that moment when it suddenly just went poof and disappeared, that I just felt lighter. I think I ran around the room cheering. I mean, there was a lot of that.
You high-fived yourself. I mean, if you're at home.
Well, it was breakfast time. I burst into the kitchen. I'm running around like a lunatic while my children stare at me going, what's going on, Daddy? I was like, the bad guys are going to jail. I mean, that was a little optimistic.
Yeah, well, exactly. And it disappears. CEO goes to jail. But the interesting thing, which we won't have time to talk about, is the COO remains missing.
Well, the COO remains missing, and it turns out, I mean, this is an entire other story, and I can let you know, just between us, that there is an FT podcast coming out in a few weeks, which is going to look all into the former Wirecard Chief Operating Officer, Jan Marsalek, who it turns out was a Russian spy and was doing all sorts of dirty tricks, and quite recently was controlling a cell of Bulgarians who have just been convicted of spying for Russia in the UK. But sadly, I don't think we have enough time to tell.
That'll be FSTC next year, or
absolutely
maybe later. Look, and I think you talked about the relief. I want to turn to the personal side of it. And interesting, when we did one of our prep sessions and Dan came onto the screen, what I actually saw behind him was the wanted poster for the COO who's missing, Marsalek. But look, throughout this thing, work-wise, obviously you're getting challenged, and I believe you were suspended. You and colleagues were suspended while there were investigations. What impact did this all have on you personally?
So it was kind of like a creeping pressure. You when the German investigation was announced, you're kind of, terrified is the wrong word, but it's kind of maddening and also then quite scary. Like, if I tried to travel, would I be arrested? That just straightforward logistical question, like, what are my risks here? Am I going to end up in handcuffs? And then, as we're reporting it, we started to pick up, details of other things that, this guy might be a Russian spy, and that's quite scary. I didn't want to fall out of any windows. And my family at risk. And then also there's this period where we realized that there was a team of 30 private detectives running around London trying to catch us talking to our sources. And in charge of that is a Libyan former head of their intelligence agency. And one of the guys flips who's involved because he thinks the whole thing is disproportionate. But he tells us they had considered this plan, but not gone through with it yet, to use this old gangland trick where they would have planted drugs in my car and then called the police. And when you hear that, that's kind of like, that would just blow up your entire life. Like the number of hours lost to imagining the scenario, like there's a knock on the door and you're like, officer, yeah, funny story. There's this German company that's out to get me. I mean, it's a weird thing because there was never like that explicit threat. And they didn't do it. But you live with this, I don't know, sense of jeopardy. Let's just say I never really, I still don't stand near the edge of any train platforms.
Right. But you're still an investigative journalist.
Yeah, no, I love it.
You're still telling stories about companies. So it couldn't have been that bad. I don't know. Maybe you're a thrill seeker. I don't know.
I mean, well, as a journalist, all you want is great stories, and this one is a great one to tell.
And we didn't, as we said, we didn't get a chance to look at sort of the spying aspects of it, but one of the descriptions in the front of the book of Dan, it says, think of Dan as James Bond with glasses and a keyboard instead of a gun. So and in many ways, it is that kind of situation. So I guess the real question that I want to know, and hopefully other people want to know, is, are there other Wirecards out there?
Oh man, there are definitely frauds out there. I mean, we've had money was free for a decade. That kind of creates an environment, and you know, everything has been about the future. Those huge themes which everyone gets very excited about, you know, the green transition, AI, and that's quite a rich environment for the fraudster. And so, yeah, I think I'm going to be busy. There's plenty of cockroaches out there.
Right, so you can follow Dan's stories. I do. I guess any sort of closing thoughts or anything you want to suggest? Any recommendations to regulators or auditors or investors? One of the things that I find interesting is I find it hard to believe that none of the investors in any of these fraudulent companies don't wonder or don't uncover things themselves. And then you go through to their psychology. Well, if I've got an investment in it, the last thing I want to do is sort of make it publicly known that there's some kind of a problem here. And so in fact, what they do is quietly sell and disappear, right?
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't dream of giving people advice. Beyond, obviously, subscribe to the Financial Times. It's a solid investment. And I think, to me, one of the most fascinating things about it is the people inside the company. You know, it's all very well to talk about, like, the people outside, should they have noticed. What do you do if you find yourself in a company where bad things might be happening? And I think most people want to do the right thing. I have great faith in human nature, but also I have great faith in human laziness. You know, people also want a quiet life. And I think the thing which Wirecard exploited was that sense that there were people inside the company who had started to realize that, hang on, if they've got this incredible money-making machine over there, what are the rest of us here for? But they never made it their business to find out or to make a noise about it. So I think that's the sort of thing which only when you encounter it can you decide what to do. And if you're not sure, talk to a journalist.
Yeah, and I think the Netflix show does a good job of interviewing a former Wirecard executive throughout, and in the final analysis, he kind of says, "Yeah, we didn't see anything, but maybe that's because we didn't really want to see anything." Right, so I do that. Well, listen, Dan, look, that's been fantastic. I could carry on. If the other panelists don't want to come up, I'm happy to carry on with that. But anyway, sorry. Listen, appreciate it. It's a fantastic story. Please, everyone, help join me in thanking Dan, not for today, but also for his ongoing efforts to keep companies honest.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you.